Here's Craig Martin's presentation on building a more cohesive organization using business architecture.
For those of you, I thought I'd drop this in here. That may look familiar to you. Back in the day, I did an introduction to the TOGAF course, and I was quite amazed looking through the specs that it's got 60,000 hits. And we're probably going to go in the process of auctioning that cardigan off. It seems to have developed a bit of a fashion reputation. Yeah? I thought of wearing it today, but it'll just really be a little aged by then. So for those of you that want to have a quick overview, that introduction is available online as well. There's also a webinar which was done prior to this conference. Can I get a show of hands who actually attended that webinar on bridging business architecture and business analysis? Okay, so there's a little bit of duplication. But the majority of you haven't attended. So you can download that, and you can get the address of that from the slide pack afterwards. So I found this on the front of a Tier 1 banking strategy. And I thought it quite humorous because it talks about a concept which I'm going to consistently refer to as we work through this morning. And it's really about the fact that there's so much of what we do is becoming commoditized, or being called utility, that will there actually be a job for us humans sometime in the future? And I found it quite interesting that particular quote was actually on a strategy document for one of the local banks. Now that brings me to this slide, which really talks about, well, what actually is business all about? And it's a fairly simple little framework, and just talks about the fact that business is striving to just build advantages, prolong advantages, and reduce disadvantages. And at the bottom of business, there is this utility layer. And what makes business, what allows them to build differentiators is how they can innovate, mix, and assemble those building blocks that sit underneath. So this particular diagram I'm going to refer to quite a few times as we work our way through. Now, with that in mind, we want to just work through a little bit of strategy around how do we actually mix, assemble, and innovate those building blocks. And we'll start up here in the strategic planning space. Now, one of the challenges we have in a lot of clients is that although there is confusion at the architectural layer around concepts like capability, process, and all the rest of it, in actual fact, the confusion starts way earlier than that. The confusion starts right up in the strategic landscape, just with definitions like vision, mission, strategies, and goals. So that's why we've used things like the business motivation model to pin a lot of what we base our outputs on. And there's a lot of material available in that business motivation model. But really what we're saying is that up at this sort of strategic level is actually where things start to come off the tracks. What traditionally occurs within transformation projects is that there is a group strategy, and they follow some or other technique, and that cascades its way down through the hierarchy of the organization until eventually it arrives at a series of strategic business units, which in turn kick off a series of programs, which in turn go ahead and build separate business models, go and initiate their own strategic planning processes, and fragmentation tends to cascade downwards. And that results in a lot of confusion within the mind of the stakeholders. And these are some of the typical questions we get from some of our C-level clients as they're looking at this proliferation of projects, 180, 250 projects are just some of the examples. So looking through that landscape is, well, what's going on out there? I don't actually know. Are we doing the right thing? Are we investing our money in the right place? There's all of this effort going on, but I have absolutely no visibility because the majority of executives tend to look through that portfolio through the lens of a project management lens focus. So what that results in is what we refer to as loss of cohesion. Now this is from an interesting article published in Harvard Review based on the Coherency premium, and really talks about this concept of coherency around and the impact that coherency has on financial returns of a company. And coherency is really all about trying to string together all of the components of your business in a way that is synergistic, right? And in a way that will help you improve your market position, your product and portfolio, and the strategic capabilities that sit underneath that. So it's looking for that synergy across an entire enterprise. And that previous graph talks about actual benefits to the bottom line for organizations that do have a strong cohesion. And that's been one of the challenges is around trying to build cohesion into an organization when they're actually approaching it, trying to solve those problems from different perspectives. And those are the perspectives I'm going to deal with later on. Now, one of the techniques to help with cohesion, and you've heard it the last couple of presentations, is all about this concept of capability planning, capability-based planning. And we stick with the normal principle. Capability is a combination of people, process, and tools to drive out an outcome. And the point is it's the outcome focus of the capability. We often see capability maps, and they're nice boxes on a piece of paper. And often they only have one or two of those dimensions. We refer to them as resources attached to that capability. In actual fact, capability-based planning is all about the mix. How well do I mix those resources? In other words, people, process, and tools to drive an outcome. It's not just about one or two items, it's the mix. And that is true architecting. Right? Architecting is not cataloging all of the capabilities. Architecting is trying to identify what those resources are and mixing them in the correct way to achieve different outcomes. And really the challenge exists around, well, number one, we need to identify the right resources, and that's the catalog space. But number two, even within that capability, I need to figure out, well, what's the best mix of those resources to help me achieve those outcomes? Right? And then to take that a step further, I need to then take it to the point of looking at how do I mix the actual capabilities to create what we call cross-functional capabilities. In other words, stringing large building blocks of the organization together to affect sort of market performance. Now, this particular knowledge funnel, and this is the challenge that most businesses are faced with, right, is from a book called The Design of Business by Roger Martin, which is a fairly good read if any of you want to take the time to work through it. And it talks about how we take unresolved business challenges and move them down this knowledge funnel till eventually we get them down into, let's call it a utility layer, till we get to a stage in which we have robust and repeatable and replicable formulas and processes. And our challenge as architects is being able to help the business move as quickly as possible from that top part of the knowledge funnel right down to the bottom, where we can begin to industrialize some of those repeatable processes. And that's the challenge not just of architecture, it's the challenge of Lean and Six Sigma, the business analysis community, a number of other frameworks are all having this challenge of trying to build that industrialization layer in the most efficient manner. Now what we've done as well, just to take that model a little further, is to look at the left and right brains. And this is just a quick intro into that. All right, so what we've got here is taking Roger Martin's work a little further forward, is we looked at, well, what sort of talents must exist within the minds of an architect or a business analyst. And you can download our Headspace, which just search for the EA Headspace on Google, and it'll give you an idea of that downloadable poster that you can have a look at and work with. But it's all about, well, there's a middle ground here. There's a middle ground that exists between the analytical way of delivering outcomes, which are robust, repeatable, and replicable, versus the intuitive side, which is in solving complex business problems. And in the middle there is the space which has to try and bring these two worlds together. Now, Roger Martin refers to that space as design thinking. But from our perspective, I actually refer to that space as that's the world of the business architect. The business architect sits in the middle there and has to have an understanding of the left-hand side as well as the right-hand side and how to bring these two worlds together. Hearing a little of the talk from yesterday, there's a lot to say about what we refer to as the mandate of architecture. In other words, well, it's nice to be able to do these things, and we hear all the theory, but we never have the opportunity to actually do them. And that's what we refer to as the mandate. In other words, as an architecture practice, what mandate has the business given you? Have they given you the mandate to just improve project performance or enterprise-wide project performance, or go right up the curve there to go and actually look at improving market performance? And that's really is a strong dictator of how you will define your business architecture practice and the types of outcomes that your practice have to produce. In other words, the operating model of a business architecture practice is quite different at A and B versus what it would look like at E. So all of the outcomes in that would need to be defined quite differently. And they have different challenges to face as well. And let's just call these three spaces, and these are three spaces I'm going to break down. So at the bottom there we have business improvement space, we then have the business transition space, and an enterprise planning and performance space. So these are sort of the three areas that we can operate within. And you can kind of see from the bubbles that these are some of the challenges that you would have to face. And just looking through those challenges, you can see that, well, there's quite a diversified set of tools that I would use to solve some of those problems. I mean, dealing with mergers and acquisitions and the implications of that upon my business are quite different from rolling out an enterprise-wide ERP or CRM system, right? So there are different tools that you're going to need. And that's always what I say about these tools called frameworks. TOGAF is a tool. Each of you out there has a toolbox. And in your toolbox, you've got a variety of these tools that you're going to pull out and use, all right? And there's a variety of frameworks that would need to be applied across that entire spectrum, all right? And TOGAF is one of those that provides that value to allow you to build that utility layer at the bottom of that little framework that I showed you. Right, so let's go delve into the different scenarios. So this is the typical problem we have when we encounter transformation projects. In other words, strategy's been done somewhere, right? A bunch of strategic themes and initiatives have been developed, and they're allocated down to business unit. PMO takes charge, and each business unit runs with a series of programs, streams, and their own sets of initiatives. Within those, they bring on their own suppliers and vendors, and a variety of different types of business models are developed. And it's normally quite interesting to see how many different types of definitions you have. There's capability models, there's process models, there's target operating models, there are business models, there's all a variety of different terms depending upon which vendor is delivering a solution to which particular business division. And that's really where fragmentation begins to occur. Now, scenario 2 says, well, let's see if we can bring the business architecture up a level. And this is now moving more into the improved business performance. So can we improve the mandate of business architecture and get to the point where we can start to, instead of identifying initiatives in our strategic themes, we can start to build capabilities. And those capabilities help us define an enterprise business model. And that's the sort of standard that we use for defining a business model. And it kind of looks like the business model canvas for those of you that had worked with it, but we've diced and spliced it in a different way, all right? So the point is to try and now define that business model so that all of my underlying business units have this central map that they can work with, and I'll give you some examples later. However, first prize, all right, would be to move the practice slightly higher up the stack. And that would be to get involved into what is referred to as the strategic planning process. And that's really like, well, how do we help the business identify strategic scenarios? And how do we then use the skills and techniques that we have in business architecture to show them what the business could actually look like for each of those scenarios? And then allow them to make the correct decision based upon those, the inputs that we've given them. And that's the particular one that I want to expand a little further on. So what we have, we start in the beginning, you have a bunch of drivers, you build things like driver tree hierarchies, use tools like an economic value analysis, all right, to try and look at, well, what drivers are affecting the organization and how we can cascade it down. Those help you build out a series of goals, and you can then decompose that across an entire enterprise. Good tool to have to help guide architectural effort, because those are the outcomes that you're eventually going to link your capabilities to. All right? Now, for each of those scenarios, you can begin to assess them against what we refer to as value disciplines, which is part of the tricky stuff. All right? So, at a value discipline level, we often find in large-scale organizations that different parts of the business are operating on using different value disciplines. And it's actually quite conflicting. So some of them are looking at customer intimacy, whereas some of them are focusing on operational excellence. And a lot of the decision-making on those value disciplines is impacted, all right, by that particular discipline that they're enforcing. So, you know, you can imagine the discipline around customer intimacy, and all the decisions associated to how I assemble my capabilities would look quite different than if I was following a discipline of operational excellence. And there's no, obviously these disciplines work in synergy, but you've got to have a strong focus on one, and we often find that's what's missing. So you tend to take your scenarios and map them against those types of strategic, let's call it offerings or disciplines, right? Now let's take each of those scenarios. We have a business model definition. I can now take a semi-integrated universal bank, which is one of the strategic scenarios, and let's say, well, from a business architecture perspective, well, what will that actually look like? And this is where the value of business architecture as a strategic enabler comes in. If there is a standard way to do this, you can now drill down and begin to give the business a view of what does a business model look like for that scenario. Now, across that business model, there's a variety of different artifacts that have to be developed. And In most situations, most of the frameworks, the common standardized frameworks, would tend to deal with the bottom level there, the operating model. All right? And then in the middle there, you're kind of seeing some of the design thinking frameworks, all right? Some of the value maps and product and offering product architecture, which, by the way, is often a glaring hole in a number of organizations. It's a proper product architecture. All right? And then kind of going up to the top in which there's customer experience and journey maps and those types of outcomes. But if you're defining a business model for each scenario, you have to look across all of those perspectives. And you have to use a series of tools to help you identify what each of those views have to be for your customer. Now, the problem that we have is when we go into organizations, right, there's a undefined ownership problem. Right? So up at the top, business ownership tends to sit quite well within the market and the product space. Down the bottom under the CIO, there's normally good ownership within the IT space. But sitting in the middle there is that little ethereal world of the business space and the business architecture space. And often doesn't seem to have the correct ownership. Doesn't seem to have the correct mandate. And most organizations, it's sitting under the CIO, sitting in the IT department. Right? And for those of you that read some of the work by the Corporate Executive Board, looking at some of the statistics around how many business architectures fail because they report to the CIO versus them being driven by business. So there's an interesting correlation there. Obviously, those that are driven by business are more successful. But not only is there's undefined ownership sitting in the middle there, there's also undefined ownership sitting on the side. In other words, the discipline to build cohesion across that entire business model. Well, who's responsible for that? If you walk into any large enterprise, you try and find one individual or one team responsible for that, they're often quite difficult to find. And they don't have the ownership and they don't have the mandate. So sometimes that person isn't even wearing the label of a business architect or any of those things. They're sitting as the subject matter experts in some enterprise planning or integrated business planning team. The point is to try and find them, because those are the ones that are going to help with that synergy. So I'm going to break down each of those pieces on the right now. So let's look at functional capabilities and then cross-functional. I'm not going to deal with enterprise coherency capabilities today. We won't have time. But you can discuss it with me afterwards if you want some more detail on that. So what you traditionally have is a functional capability model. In other words, what the business does. And we've heard the talk of that, and you've seen a couple of examples and reference models yesterday. So I won't bore you with the detail. Boxes with names in them. All right? And that's normally what they look like. And that is a map of your enterprise. And what you've got to look at it as is the same as a map of a city. Once you have the map of Sydney, I can now overlay a variety of different views onto that map. I can overlay the electricity grid. I can overlay the water grid. I can overlay the population spread onto this single unified view. And that's why we call it an anchor model. Right? So this is a business anchor model, and it's a capability-based business anchor model. But a capability anchor model that only has a name in it, right, in my opinion, is not a capability model. Right? It needs a little more work. And a capability, as we've learnt, is a definition of people, process, and tools to drive out an outcome, which implies that as you look at those capabilities, you must have an understanding of those underlying resources that you're actually assembling. Right? And we use what we refer to as super shapes to document that. Now, our Uber shape, we call it, which is on the far right there, pretty much talks about everything that we want to know about a capability. And you can see there's a whole lot more in there than just people, process, and tools. But we've discovered that trying to fit that particular super shape on a nice A0 diagram just lent itself to complexity. So there are other ways that we skinned it, and you can see a couple of those other super shapes that we work with. Just different ways for you to overlay the same information on a functional capability model. And you can overlay your IT spend, CapEx, OpEx, you can do all those types of things. That particular model talks about the degree of change across process, data, application, technology. It looks at the degree of change, how many projects are working, the model on the left, how many projects are working on that capability, and what the proposed improvement in maturity is going to be. Now, holding one of those in front of you with all of that information on it is extremely powerful. Right? And there's a whole bunch of stories that you can communicate to your stakeholder with one of those in front of you. So here's one of them. Right? I'm just going to deal with a few of the overlays. So classic case is where am I losing coherency in my business? Right? Where's the duplication existing across a multinational business? Well, look at where the duplication exists between these two entities. So there's some consolidation that can occur. The other way to do some overlays is, well, what about some hotspots and pain points? And I raise a red flag here. Doing pain point and hotspot architecture is not a good practice. right? It does tend to be fairly tactically focused, right? And you don't get the strategic outcomes that you're looking for. But it's always good to do that because you get stakeholder buy-in. You get a seat at the table, so to speak, to talk about issues that are burning at the time. So you can overlay some hotspots on these types of models, right? You can value chain the model if you want. You can look at the strategic investment side of things, and you can look at, well, where is my capex being invested across this landscape, right? But the true value of these types of models really comes in when I actually combine them. And I start to look at them side by side. And you can start to see, well, hold on, I've got hotspots over here, but I don't have any investment occurring in it. So there's something's not right here. What's happening? All right? And what we try and do with architecture is allow the architecture to speak for itself. In other words, not have us come with a whole bunch of recommendations, but if we take stakeholders through a walkthrough, they actually see these things standing out from the diagrams that we produce. Right? And therefore, the architecture speaks for itself. And that's actually our tick in our box for a job done well, is when we get to that particular point. Now, that's the functional space. A note of warning around functional capability model. It has a short lifespan. Stakeholders get over your functional capability model very quickly. And unfortunately, the functional capability model tends to be bottom up. In other words, it tends to be driven by technology because they want a language to communicate properly with business. 90% of these types of exercises occur driven by that particular part of the business. All right. So it's a good tool to start with. It gives you a first view of your utility, but it's not going to keep your business excited for long. Right? One of the other things that we discovered as we built capability models, and sorry I had to obfuscate some of that content early this morning, I realized there was some stuff in there, is to basically, when you talk to stakeholders, don't talk about capabilities. Talk about the resources. Talk about the mix. So you talk about people, process, tools, and outcome. And all of your presentations and all of the artifacts that you produce, they are talking about people, process, tools, and outcome. Later on, you can cluster that all together and you can get your nice little capability model from it. And you can still use that as a tool to bind it all together. But when you're talking to stakeholders, make sure you talk about the resources, not capabilities. It makes that model far more usable within the business community, right? And you find that they start to talk that language because it makes a little more sense to them than dealing with sometimes an ethereal concept called a capability. Right, so moving on from there, we now move into the cross-functional capability space. And this is really where the true value of capability-based planning, in my opinion, all right, begins to reside. Right? And that's now, we get to the space where I can take standard functional capabilities, right, and I can put them into a value chain through normal value chain modeling, those types of things. Right? And I can string them together for certain business scenarios. And it's this mixing of capabilities where the true value lies. And that's the architecting space. That's the business architecture space. It's not just the cataloging space. And some of you have probably been through a process where you measure the maturity of your capabilities. And you put that maturity across a functional capability map. That's good for a capability in a standalone version. However, those capabilities are used in a variety of different places across the business. So what could be quite mature for one area, right, in one particular cross-functional capability, is quite immature in another. Right? And that's the point of doing, when you do a maturity assessment, you actually do it in light of cross-functional capabilities, because now you're actually dealing with outcome. You're actually dealing with those bits on the right. So those are sort of 3 cross-functional or 4 cross-functional capabilities, stringing together different building blocks that sit within my normal functional capability space. And because it's a cross-functional capability, doesn't mean that it's any different from the other capabilities. It still has people, still has process, it still has tools, and it still has an outcome. It has information, it has performance, all of those things still apply. It is actually just a bigger piece of glue that links this all together to make it more valuable to business. All right, and I think yesterday, I forget what the presentation was, I also referred to as an ability to test scenarios. So you can actually insert your scenarios in here to validate your capability models. So that is one of the additional benefits that you can use at a cross-functional space. Some of the ways that we also do it, to get into a little more detail. So here you have an iServer Archimate-based model, right, which looks at a cross-functional capability and kind of gives you a good view, well, how do we actually string together people, process, and tools into a visual that we can actually show to our clients. But sometimes it's a little bit, you've got a square box, but what goes inside that square box? So there are ways to represent that information, all right? And the process layer plays a strong role in that. So there's lots of space for good process-oriented thinking within the business architecture space. And sometimes I find that that doesn't exist. There tends to be a slightly higher level of abstraction within business architect mindsets, with not a solid understanding of process engineering techniques. So process is extremely important within that particular landscape. Another way that you can string together your building blocks to begin to drive out more value is to look at customer experience. So customer experience is obviously a way to determine and change an experience of an emotional experience of your customers. In other words, how do I improve their emotional experience through every interaction? So you look at your touch points. You look at the emotional impact of each of those touch points across your organization. You look at the products and services that they interact with, and then you look at the underlying capabilities that enable those products and services. And you've got that traceability. You now know what parts of the organization to tweak to improve your customer experience. The problem I find with customer experience is often it tends to avoid the products and services layer. It's kept separate. But it's your customers are having their experience through the use and the interaction of your products and services. So you can't bypass it. It has to exist. Right? So proper product engineering techniques still need to be in there. The interaction with design models. That's what design thinking is all about. It's about improving the experience that your customers have with your products. So those particular pieces are missing. All right. Now, just to think a little further ahead, and this is something we're playing with now, and it's hopefully get a little more momentum. We've heard the talk around reference models, but we often refer to these things called business model stereotypes. And the business model stereotypes were coined by Roger Martin as well, or was it the Booz guys? I forget, okay? And what it looks at is ways that you can actually define different business models and the outcomes that they achieve, right? And that is really the utility layer of business architecture. Here is the space, right, in which I can look at a series of standard business models that I can now use to drive out different outcomes within an organization. So when I'm looking at strategic scenarios, I don't have to start with a clean sheet. I can start with stuff that's already available. And those business models, right, are documented. Yeah? Each business model can be documented in a very similar way to the way we document all the other models. And there are good reference points. Slightly more advanced than what we would term a reference model, because it looks at the pattern of how those blocks are actually assembled, not just necessarily the reference model. So slightly forward thinking, but definitely a space that I think could gain some additional momentum. And I'm so pleased to see the creation of vertical reference models groups within the open group. And I think there's definitely room for things like finance, for things like higher education. So if any of you are interested in tackling any of those things as a vertical industry within the open group, since it's member driven, I think it's definitely something that you can take under your wing. Yeah? Right, now, one of the things that we have with customers is those capability models. They're all good, and there's a little bit of complexity there. They don't quite get it, but they're coming along for the ride. A suitable business motivation model, all right, is much more valuable than a capability model because it talks about outcome. And these are the types of things that your stakeholders, your business stakeholders, walk around with. However, you give this business motivation model to a bunch of architects, and they're like, this is elementary. However, for business people, this is what they've been looking for. A way that they can use and guide their decisions, all right, and to show how it's actually linked to underlying capabilities in the organization. So business motivation model mapping and modeling, all those things are extremely valuable, especially in getting into the headspace of your stakeholders. And that also talks to that means to an end model that I showed you in the beginning. So there's a variety of things that you can do. So this particular model looks at the capability dimensions, right, and measures the percentage of each of those dimensions and the contribution to the value drivers. Okay? This is now looking at the mix within a capability. It says, well, is that mix actually optimal, right, to achieve those particular outcomes? You can apply similar techniques to the broader cross-functional capabilities, all right? But these are the types of things that you'll begin to do as you architect. This is architecting, all right? This is when we talk about business architecture. Look through those bunch of Harvey balls and tell me where I can optimize, all right, to get a better outcome. So that's the point of architecting. A couple of things that we do is we take all this data and we throw it in a couple of BI tools. We produce some interesting graphs. Sometimes you don't actually know what you're going to get out of that. You produce some, you dice and splice your data, and out pops some amazing discoveries, right? So some of these graphs here referred to, the middle one referred to loss of coherence across an enterprise. In other words, there were projects that had 77 streams trying to make updates to one capability. That's 77 meetings, introductory meetings and workshops and all the rest of it, just for one capability and the process layer in that capability. I mean, what a complete loss of productivity in that situation. So you can use these techniques to identify those and then make recommendations to your customers around, well, consolidate all of these capabilities into this cross-functional, create a separate program, and you're going to get greater efficiencies out of it. The bottom graph looks at the loss of cohesion across all the project landscape. So we measure the cohesion across effort occurring across an organization, and we can determine that some of these capabilities are just completely fragmented across a huge project landscape. And something needs to be done about it because there's too much duplication. So these are the types of things that you can do when you start to get to this data. All right? This particular one looks at strategic importance of my capabilities and my project coverage. All right? And I'm able to determine, well, where can I move funds from my top right quadrant to my bottom left, because there's a bit of a big gap. All right? There's lots of work that will go behind this, but ultimately this particular view will give a stakeholder a response to a question of, am I investing my money in the right place? The biggest challenge on the back of something like this is change management, which, by the way, is a big piece that is missing out of the architecture world. How do we actually change? We're good at producing roadmaps and planning and those things, but change is huge. How do I change people? We know all of this information, right? But in actual fact, the business is only able to absorb just this little piece here. And this is incredibly exasperating to someone like me, and I'm sure to a number of you, is that you've got this information, you know how to do it, you know how to solve it, but business just hasn't quite come along for the ride. And that is the biggest challenge. And one of the ways that we've recommended previously to try and solve that is to build what we refer to as cross-discipline teams. And sometimes if we can roll them into the IBP team, which is the Integrated Business Planning team, even better. The point of a capability is that people, process, and tools to drive out an outcome through projects, and it needs money to do it. So let's get all those people together into one team. They're all trying to achieve the same thing. They're all looking enterprise-wide across the organization. So let's put the people, process, tools, people in one team with somebody from finance and with somebody from strategy and with somebody from projects. And then have a look at synergies across an entire enterprise landscape. And those types of techniques go a long way, right, to trying to realizing the value of that synergy, but often struggle with finding ownership of that particular team. The other ways to do it, also look at degrees of change. At your process layer, there's some change frameworks that you can use, all right, to apply to varying levels of process change. I'm going to skip forward a little bit, running out of time. At the end of the day, you're going to take your business models. So there are the strategic scenarios. I've now looked at each of those strategic scenarios. I've taken the business models. I've built functional and cross-functional views of what each of those strategic scenarios could look like. Well, let's now evaluate them against a predefined set of drivers. So, let's look at the business model. And, well, what parts of that business model achieve the greatest benefit for my strategic scenarios? You can roll them up into this. I like this one, which is looking at some of the cross-functional capabilities and looks at the types of change required across each of those strategic scenarios. And you can kind of get a view from incremental to significant to transformational change, and get a view at the bottom as well, what's the time frame and impact. So in other words, strategic decision makers sit with something like this in front of them. They're able to make a decision around what type of business to pursue. Not only that, if they make a decision around the type of business that you're recommending, you've done a large portion of the modeling already. You've done a large portion of the analysis. A good portion of your strategic architecture is complete. And you've got the buy-in that you need. This is what we refer to as business architecture as a strategic enabler. Trying to get to this point where you can make those types of decisions and have that input into strategic planning discipline. Then comes the more detailed process. When we talk about capabilities don't magically mature, they mature over time. Which means that I need to build capability increment maps. Right? And I need to be able to improve that maturity over time and be able to build that in a series of roadmaps. And these are the roadmaps that enterprise architects is normally quite famous for, right, which is our own intellectual property of how we actually represent the complexity of those capability increments and all of that understanding of planning in simple, consolidated, well, I don't know whether you classify it as simple and consolidated, do we do? Okay. roadmaps which look at, your strategic means to an end on the top left, all your drivers in the middle and which programs are implementing them, current state on the left, future state on the right, assumptions and principles. Good little things to walk around with. And if you've got the time, we've got our flip books outside on the desk, which have all of these diagrams in them with a little more detail if you can't read them. And we'll show you a variety of, excuse me, different models and artifacts that we've produced for clients in the past. But ultimately, that's where the rubber hits the road. And we want to be able to pull our capabilities into that space. Final recommendation is to look at your storyboard. Great ways, by the way, to get your stakeholders on board. Take all of this models, put it on the wall, create wall walkthroughs. We've left this stuff up for weeks and weeks in client space, and we've even seen some of our competitors late at night walking through there making notes. All right? So it's an interesting advertisement, but also just gets people familiar with the architecture and its visibility and what it actually produces. Just in closing, this is from my talk predominantly to the business analysis community, and that there is actually an overlap that exists between the business analysis discipline and the business architecture discipline. We must stop kidding ourselves to think that it doesn't exist. Okay? The Babcock refers to a business architect in there and has got a fairly solid and robust definition of what a business architect must do and a career path. And in actual fact, I think the Babcock's a little more mature in this space. So go and have a look at my webinar. I actually compare the Babcock to the Business Architecture Guild, which is the BizBock, and I compare it to TOGAF, just to see where their strengths and weaknesses lie. But what I'm proposing here is that there is a synergy. There's a synergy at the top there into what we recall. You can group them together into a principal business architect, and you can group their top layers into a strategic business architect. The problem that the business analysis community has is they don't have a career path. All right? Their career path is actually either to become a project manager or to become a business architect. And as an architecture community, we need to give that business analysis community a career path. There's many, many, many more business analysts out there than what there are business architects. Right? And they love this space. They like it. They're impassioned by it. Right? And that's a good resource to pull from to be able to build good business architects. So the problem is lack of opportunity. The problem is getting business to give us that opportunity. Right? So in other words, getting business to improve that mandate, allowing us to basically operate at that strategic enablement level. And I'm over time, but this big one I just need to communicate to you. So there is a looking at some of the business architecture mandate, some of the artifacts that you could expect to deliver across a broader spectrum of views, and you can kind of get a view from here as to where some of the roles actually exist, just from the strategic business architect down to the senior business analyst. Right? And then some of the more traditional roles of the business analyst, business architect, and then obviously going into more the solution architect and the enterprise architect. But there's overlap which is causing a lot of confusion, especially in the business architecture space. And the overlap, you can see, is in that dirty place in the middle there. And the business architects and the business analysis community needs to differentiate themselves away from the IT space, because that's where often where that overlap is sitting. And that's the challenge for the business architecture community, is not to be IT driven, to not sit within the IT space, is to be able to lobby your stakeholders to position your practice into something that's more business or that's reporting to business and not IT. All right, I'm going to skip that one. You can do that in the download pack. That just looks at the journey of taking complex stuff from a mergers and acquisition space and the different roles and where they play across that perspective. That's it. Thank you.